When we were at Computex this year, I got a little bit of a hands-on with the new ROG Ally, and my first impressions were a bit, what's the right word for this? Meh. Now, I've used the Valve Steam Deck, and that device there, even though I don't own one, feels like more thought was put into the device itself, and the ROG Ally, if I'm being honest, just from the get-go, without talking about specs and hardware and whatnot, feels like it was a little bit rushed. The idea of the ROG Ally is to essentially have a portable gaming PC in your hand, and it allows you to play games that you already own on many other platforms without having to purchase them again for another device. That's, let's say, something like a Nintendo Switch, or if any other company decides to bring out a handheld. This just means anything you've got, you can play. Now, the Steam Deck's approach to this was, hey, let's build our own flavor and our own Linux distro called SteamOS for the Steam Deck itself. And it has a lot of custom things that it does to make it a really good portable gaming PC. What's weird about this device from the jump is the way that Windows runs. Now, it's a full fat desktop operating system. It does have a couple optimizations for handheld mode, but it feels almost as though it's a tacked on feature. It doesn't feel super native. Asus has done a pretty good job with Armoury Crate. You can change the power modes. You can have turbo mode, performance mode, silence mode, whatnot. And you can really tune this for battery life, but if I'm being honest, the battery life is pretty meh, which kind of defeats the purpose of it being a portable gaming PC. That being said, a lot of people with Nintendo Switches have pretty bad battery life because a lot of people's Switches are old and batteries degrade over time. I'm going no script here, and this is just stuff that I've been gathering over the last few weeks while testing and playing with this thing. There's been a few issues, like I've seen reports from people that I know and from people that work in the industry talking about it melting micro SD cards and killing micro SD cards. So there's that. Also, recently the firmware update came out to boost performance a little bit. People are having a few issues with that as well. So there's a lot of things to me that still make me feel like this device here is kind of beta. I feel like we're being beta testers here. That's not saying that everything with the Ally is bad. This is a very, very cool device. In terms of specs, it's actually quite interesting because the processor is a Ryzen Z1 Extreme processor. Now, this is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU, which boosts up to 5.1 gigahertz. It's also Zen 4 based as well, so it's the latest AMD architecture. It's got an integrated GPU or an APU, whatever you want to call it. It's based on RDNA 3, which is AMD's latest graphics architecture. As well as that, it's got 12 compute units and boosts up to around 2.7 gigahertz. For memory, it's got 16 gigs of LPDDR5 memory that runs at about 6400 megatransfers. The screen itself is a 7-inch 1080p IPS level 120 hertz screen, and when you're using this thing, it feels buttery smooth. And with things like the variable refresh rate in some titles, it's hard to see it dropping into those lower frame rates and it affecting the gameplay. I hope that makes sense. Like, it doesn't feel like a bad screen. It looks great. And when you play some AAA titles, in your hand, it looks really great, but I'm veering off a bit. For storage, this one here is complete base spec, and they come with a 512 gig NVMe M.2 drive in the 2230 form factor. Any drive that's 2230, you can replace it and upgrade the ROG Ally. So the entry point for price here in Australia is around $12.99, but guaranteed you're gonna wanna upgrade your storage straight out of the gate. I would say 2 terabyte is probably about where you'd want something like this, basically because you install a couple AAA titles and it already begins to fill up. Not only that, there's stuff like if you wanted to buy a case for it or a stand and just a bunch of other accessories, micro SD card, that kind of stuff as well. So $12.99 Australian dollars, like if we're talking about the price here, yeah, that's not telling the whole story. There's other cool little things as well. It's got an Oculink port on the top as well. So if you wanted to use this as a desktop computer, you can do that too by plugging in an external GPU. But I'm sure Jared's Tech has covered this in detail. So I'll put a link to Jared's video about the Ally in the description down below, where he probably talks about all these things. Thanks, Jared. You always look after us, mate. The device in your hand feels pretty good. The ergonomics are better than I expected them to be. Like I said, when we were in Taiwan at Computex, I did play around with one for a bit, and that's one of the things I found too. What you're seeing on the screen here, just a few things I've installed and been playing around with. These are titles we also use for benchmarking, so stay tuned for that. I did benchmark this device, but one thing that interested me more than anything with the Ally was the ability to play not AAA titles, just like things like remote play. And I know you could buy another device that just does that, but when using remote play, I was a little bit disappointed to find that the built-in controller just doesn't work at all. I know for Sony, because they're making their own handheld streaming device, that the fact that remote play doesn't work with something like the Ally is kind of lame, considering they're trying to get into the whole PC gaming thing. But anyway, we have other apps like Chiaki, which is a third-party remote play app for PS4 and PS5, which if I just go back into that session, look at that. It now allows me to play with the built-in controller. This is Final Fantasy 16. Yeah, I've already finished the game. Sorry for any spoilers if anything comes up, but yeah, maybe one thing you're noticing with this though is the audio. This is just something that I've been trying to tweak, but there's a little bit of stutter with the audio. But ultimately, this is a pretty great experience for playing your PS5 in your hand. Like, it doesn't feel like there's too much input lag and stuff like that. And I know this is me basically just rambling on because this is a piece of third-party software that is built by the community to do this, but I mean, this is pretty dang cool, right? Look at this. Final Fantasy 16 in my hand, running buttery smooth except for the audio. Staggered, baby. But how about titles that run natively on the device and not using remote play? Well, I've been playing a bit of Forza Horizon 5. I want to show you this because I think this is pretty interesting. Remember, this experience that I'm showing you guys is on the charger. I'm going to show you what it looks like when it's off the charger as well, and how dramatically the performance can decrease here. You probably can't see the frame rate right now, but we're getting around anywhere from 70 to 80 frames per second with lows of probably around 65, but ultimately this runs pretty excellently on the Ally. In terms of graphics settings, I can show you guys that stuff on the medium preset, and I've got FSR turned on and it appears to run really, really well. So this frame rate is pretty decent, but remember, we're running on wall power, which does net better results for this device. Let me show you what it's like when we unplug it. So at the moment, we're running at 30 watts of power. Pull the adapter out. We're now on battery. The frame rate hasn't changed at all. You might be able to hear the fans still being ramped up, so it's not a quiet device. Let's change it to silent mode. So what this does is it drops the power to about 10 watts. And now we've got a very cinematic 24 frames per second in Forza on these settings. Now, you can go ahead and you can either reduce the resolution or you could reduce the graphical fidelity, but you know, that's completely up to you. This is a racing game, so you would want as many frames per second as possible, but in this mode, yeah, it's not that great. Let's change it to performance mode. Performance mode uses about 15 watts of power, and with 5 extra watts, the frame rate is more than double. Excuse my terrible driving here in Forza, but yeah, we're getting around 60 FPS, which looks buttery smooth on 15 watts of power. Now, again, we can change that to turbo mode, which puts it up to 25 watts, not 30 watts that you get when you're plugged in, and the frame rate bumps up to around about 70 frames per second after that. To see that the way they've implemented a lot of the settings, like being able to change the power profile on the fly, is super accessible. It's just one tap away on the screen. In Cyberpunk, that doesn't necessarily translate the same way. So I've got the telemetry turned on here so we can see what it is. This is the stuff built into the Ally. For graphics, I set it to the Steam Deck preset, right? And the reason why I thought this was interesting is because the Steam Deck, on paper, is a slower device. Again, we're on power. Frame rate is about 35 to 36 with the system set to turbo mode. Now, that's fine. I mean, that's actually kind of playable for Cyberpunk. We can lower the settings even more, but if we want it to look like this, right, we're gonna leave it like this. So the frame rate right now is hitting around 40 frames, 46, closer to 50 frames per second. Pull out the power. Now, we're in turbo mode on battery, which drops the power by 5 watts. We're seeing 42 FPS. This is probably not a great indication based on where we are on the map. Going through the city, you can see the frame rate drops significantly when we're in turbo mode on battery at that 25 watt setting. Now, let me show you what happens if we drop that from turbo to performance. So this is 15 watts. FPS is around 30 frames per second still. So between turbo and non-turbo, it's still looking fine, I suppose. But if you want it to be quiet, we're gonna get a slideshow when hitting like 10 or 11 frames per second. So, you know, not very playable, but as you can see with Cyberpunk, the story is very, very different. We'll go back to performance. We can see the APU starts to drink around 24 watts of power with the telemetry in the top right. So yeah, I mean, whatever mode it says it's on, it still will pull a little bit more power than that. For less demanding titles like Skater XL, you're looking at frame rates from anywhere between 85 to 100 frames with the default settings when you launch the game. So I can show you what they are. In settings, we're running at 1080p with the graphics quality set to high. And the game runs relatively smooth. This may not be a game that you play, but it certainly is a game that I would like to play handheld. Right? Yeah. It's just a bit weird that the controls are like not a controller, but it is at the same time. On battery, the frame rate is pretty good. This is in performance mode. If I switch this out to turbo mode, the frame rate isn't much different. It's getting closer to 90 frames per second. But if we put this in silent mode, the frame rate then drops to around 24 to 30 frames per second as well. So quite cinematic. It's almost like you shouldn't be using the silent mode at all unless you're using it as a handheld PC, doing PC things, but not for gaming things. But ultimately, for titles that are less demanding, like Skater XL and a lot of emulators, it's looking very, very interesting. Ooh, a little bit of an inward heel flip. Jack will like that. That's like his trick, and 360 hard flip. There we go. As you can see, the performance can change quite a lot, even though the intervals between the power consumption are quite low. So from 10 to 15 watts, the difference is huge. From 15 to 20, it's really not that huge. And in 30 watts, it's not much higher than, let's say, 25 watts. So what we're gonna do is run through all of that again, but as benchmarks, so you can see what the difference really is. Let's take a look. The way that I tested this was I tested with mains power and on battery power in turbo mode, performance mode, and silent mode. And this gives us a good indication of where the strengths with the ROG Ally are. So in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we actually see that on battery in performance mode, at 15 watts, it's better than on power in performance mode at 15 watts. But that's just about the most interesting thing that I noticed from Shadow of the Tomb Raider. With a screen this size running at 720p, that's the resolution I would recommend running on the ROG Ally for any games, just to get the most performance out of the system. In Cyberpunk 2077, we ran the same tests again, this time using the 720p Steam Deck preset and the 1080p Steam Deck preset. And what we're seeing here again is on turbo mode, on power, we're seeing 1 frame better performance than when we do it on battery. And we're not losing that much by dropping it by about 10 watts, which is kind of crazy. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I used the Favor Performance preset, and we're seeing that the performance here at 720p is really, really good. In performance mode on battery, we're seeing 64 FPS, which looks buttery smooth on this little 7-inch display. Finally, on battery at 720p at 15 watts in Forza Horizon 5, we're seeing 72 frames per second with FSR enabled. This is very playable for a handheld device. And if I'm being honest, once again, at 720p on this little 7-inch display, this game looks fantastic. As you can see from the testing, the ROG Ally is not the most powerful device, but you need to temper your expectations. What you're getting is a 7-inch 1080p screen, and resolutions like 720p on medium settings work great on this on battery in performance mode. It looks good, it performs well, and overall, the device is not really a device I would use, but I was interested enough just to see what all the hype and all the fuss was with handheld PCs. But let us know if you want to see us do more of these handheld PCs. They are an interesting form factor. I can tell you now that over the next few years, these handheld PCs are going to become a lot more popular. I get there's things like the GPD Win 4, there's all the AO Neo stuff, as well as the Ally and the Steam Deck, and there's probably a bunch of other devices they can get your hands on that will have similar performance. But I think ASUS, in terms of marketing this device, has kind of made it more accessible for people, although it's not perfect. And let us know what you guys think about the ROG Ally down below in the comments. Like I said, it's an interesting enough device. It's cool that you can play AAA titles in your hand. The battery life could be a heck of a lot better. I know I didn't really talk about it, but through testing, yeah, it's not great, but it's a handheld PC. And as time goes on and we get better batteries for these devices, it's going to get better. This is only the first gen for ASUS. Let's see what they bring next time. If you like the music you heard here, I make all the music. It's available by clicking that join button right down there, down below. Make sure you get yourself subscribed and let us know if you want to see more handheld PC videos, because as I mentioned, not my cup of tea, but still pretty cool to play around with. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I'm your benchmarked out boy Nick with Gear Seekers. You peak, we seek. Wow, I did a lot of testing with this thing to give you guys all the numbers that I thought were relevant and some pretty interesting results. I think the only title that I would probably use on this thing, Claire, would be Skater XL.
I played Skater XL on it.
It runs really well, and I'm a skateboarder, so having like a skate sim in your hand is very, very cool. But they need to finally bring out Skater XL for Nintendo Switch. They keep saying that they're bringing it, but Easy Day Studios is just such a bad developer. They don't care about the community at all. And I don't like the controls for Session, so yeah, Skater XL it is for me.